Living in the Detroit area, I'm surrounded by people who share a passion for cars, car culture, and automotive history. Yes, Detroit made muscle cars with V8 engines, but Detroit was also home to one of the most successful electric vehicle manufacturers in the world. In this video, let's go for a spin and learn about the Detroit Electric, a century old battery electric vehicle with an interesting story. Let me introduce you to Bill. I ran into him at a show for antique electric vehicles, and later he was kind enough to take me for a ride in one of the two Detroit Electrics in his garage. I'm going to use videos from our conversation and mix that in with other historical details and images. William C. Anderson of Milton, Ontario, moved to Port Huron, Michigan after graduating business school. He founded the Anderson Carriage Company, a successful manufacturer of high end horse drawn carriages and buggies since 1884. Most of their sales were going to Detroit, so the company moved there in 1895 and they got lured into the emerging horseless carriage business. Rather than developing a gasoline internal combustion engine or a gasoline fired steam engine, they went down the electric motor path. Around at the turn of the century, all three powertrain options were vying to be the preferred choice. They called their car the Detroit Electric, and it was offered in a few body styles. In 1911, they changed their name to Anderson Electric Automobile Company, reflecting the growing popularity of the car business. You'll see on the sill plate, it still shows the name Anderson as the manufacturer of the Detroit Electric. By 1919, they changed their name to just Detroit Electric because that's what they were known for. Detroit Electrics were made from 1907 all the way through the 1920s and beyond. Early in the auto industry, roadsters with a soft top were the most common body type, and Anderson did start off making roadsters, but in their second year, they offered an enclosed body, kind of like being inside of a phone booth. An enclosed body was very uncommon during this time, but it seemed to fit the nature of electric vehicles, quiet and clean. There was some evolution of the enclosed body design during these years, position and style of lights. Early models did not have a bumper. Very early models have a smaller nose. It grew in size to accommodate larger batteries. By the 19 teens, the classic Detroit Electric look was born, and it changed very little from there on. The easiest way to spot a Detroit Electric is, well, obviously the lack of a radiator in the front. Electric vehicles don't generate as much waste heat as a combustion engine, although some vehicles did add a fake grille to the front just to fit in, I guess. And they have a distinctive curved glass on each side of the windshield.
But for these cars, their customers wanted comfort inside, and they wanted to be enclosed. So
Yeah.
it so their market was completely different.
All of the advertising for Detroit Electric and for other electric vehicles of the day focused on how easy and civilized electric vehicles were. If you were a wealthy banker, you didn't want to get injured cranking a gas engine. If you were a doctor, you did not have 30 minutes to wait for a Stanley to build up a head of steam. And wealthy ladies loved electric vehicles. They were featured prominently in the ads. They liked the simplicity, no crank to start, no gears to shift. Wealthy women didn't have the need to drive long distances out of the city, and if they did, they would have taken a train. Early Detroit Electrics had a taller roof than the one that we drove in. Bill compared the 1925 that we drove to his wife's 1918.
But you can see the difference in height,
Oh yeah.
between 18 and 25. Well, they wanted more space in the beginning because ladies, had to wear their hats, right, when they're driving. But you had to have a garage door this tall to get it in. Mm-hmm. So, they thought, okay, a more modern garage is shorter, so why don't we make the cars shorter and sell more cars?
This 1914 Detroit Electric was donated to the Henry Ford collection. It was Clara Ford's personal vehicle. That's right. While Henry was ramping up production of the Model T to 1,000 vehicles a day, Clara was off buying someone else's car. But that was okay. The Model T and the Detroit Electric were not at all competitors. Just like A Toyota Camry and a Tesla Model S aren't competitors today.
The bodies typically are aluminum. The
Oh,
fenders are steel,
oh, okay.
and the trunks are typically steel. But the bodies, this portion of the body is aluminum.
Mhm.
On some, the doors are steel, but most are aluminum, and this portion is aluminum as well. The tops were aluminum also, which back in that, back in the teens, 100 years ago, stamping of aluminum was a real art.
Underneath the sheet is a wooden body structure. Here you see some images of a Detroit Electric that has been gutted, showing off the wooden body structure underneath the skin. Now let's talk about what makes this car go. The powertrain operates at up to 84 volts. That's true for most antique EVs. To get 84 volts, this car has seven 6-volt batteries up front and seven 6-volt batteries in the rear. 7 plus 7 is 14 times 6 is 84. That layout makes for an even weight distribution, front and rear. But the batteries in this car are very heavy and they're not low to the ground, so this vehicle is top heavy. At low speeds, the front and rear banks work in a parallel circuit, so that's 42 volts. At higher speeds, they work in series to drive a motor with 84 volts. This is made possible by a speed controller. It's an intricate mechanical device that rotates a drum, changing the contacts to determine the output of the electric motor. Now, obviously, these are modern batteries, but they still have the same basic chemistry. The original lead acid batteries were enclosed in wooden crates. Owners of these antique vehicles install modern batteries and an onboard charger. I'll let Bill explain.
Is not a trickle charger. It's basically a charger that is monitoring what's going on with the batteries. It's a computer, basically. The charger is basically programmed to the batteries. Delta Q, when you call them up, the first thing they're going to ask you is what batteries.
Early Detroit Electrics were chain drive, meaning there was a chain connecting the electric motor to the rear axle, acting as a gear reduction. Elwell Parker, a company with operations in Cleveland, made the speed controller and the electric motor for Anderson, as well as for other EV manufacturers of the day. They did such a good job that Anderson purchased them in 1910, but they continued to supply parts to rivals such as Baker Electric. In 1911, they introduced a more modern motor design that avoided the chain drive in favor of a direct shaft drive where the motor connects to the rear differential via a drive shaft, just like a combustion engine. That's a band brake around the output shaft. On the inside, there's a large pedal mechanically activating the brakes. The smaller pedal is kind of a parking brake.
What it does, it puts a clamp around the drive shaft. So the parking brake then activates the rear brakes. And I actually, when I first got this car, I ended up hitting that brake at the same time.
Oh.
And that created all sorts of problems.
The specs on modern EVs can be quite bonkers sometimes. 0 to 60, horsepower, range, charging, and kilowatts. We'll go through that, but keep in mind, back then there weren't a lot of standards for testing, and they were innovating every year, so introducing new models, and the numbers kept changing. Detroit Electrics were not powerful. The electric motor only puts out about 5 horsepower, although you can exceed that with a full battery for a short period of time. And those lead acid batteries made the vehicle heavy. Simply put, if you wanted to go fast, a steam fired powertrain was the way to go, but they heat up slowly and blow through water quickly. Gasoline internal combustion engines weren't as easy to start, but they had good power and range as long as you can find a gas filling station outside the city. Battery electric vehicles were promoted as being easy to operate and, honestly, just fast enough. The car can achieve 22 to 25 miles an hour. At the time, city roads were constructed from a variety of materials, and they were not smooth. Plus, there were often ordinances to prevent automobiles from going too fast and scaring the horses that were still being used. They can go up to 80 miles on a single charge, and that was considered good enough for daily city use. Well, I mean, enough for most people. Thomas Edison also owned a Detroit Electric, but he made his better. And from 1911 to 1916, he sold optional nickel iron batteries for $600 more. And that was a lot of money back then. But the Detroit Electric was already more than a gas combustion engine vehicle. So, golly gee, why not? In 1912, a Detroit Electric set a range record of 211 miles.
This is steering.
Hmm.
To turn left, you push it away from you. To turn right, you pull it towards you. This is called the speed control. It's not a throttle, it's called a speed control. And there's basically 5 clicks that you can feel. And so you're starting out typically using 1 bank of batteries until you get all the way up to 5. Right now, we're at using all 84 volts.
Which leads us to a question about this early electric vehicle that we still hear about today. How and where do you charge an electric vehicle? This is a map of Chicago today, showing the locations of EV charging stations. And here is a map from 1916. History! If you could afford a premium priced electric vehicle, you had electricity in your primary residence. Home chargers at the time had a mad scientist kind of look to them. Back then, the plug type, though, was quite simple. DC input into the car is a simple barrel shaped connector. The outside is negative, the inside is positive. In a modern connector, there are extra pins to allow communication between the vehicle and the power supply and for safety purposes.
At a charging station. Now, there is actually an electric car recharging station building that is still here in Detroit. It's at the corner of East Grand Boulevard and Jefferson. There's a Tim Hortons on the corner. Right behind it is a Quonset hut.
Yeah.
And that building was an electric car recharging station for the people who lived in Indian Village, which was the first suburb of Detroit.
Now, I knew the area he was talking about. I recall there being a cool design house there. It's called Prop Art Studio. I reached out to them, and sure enough, they are very aware and very proud of the history of their building. They sent some images and information that they collected. None of the original equipment exists, but the building is still very cool. If you work for an exhibit or advertising company and you need some fun props, check out their website. Really nice people. This car was targeted at affluent people, so the interior needed to be refined. And it is super plush, like grandma's sofa. Being an enclosed body, the fabric was not exposed to rain or snow. These interiors have all been redone. Some may be better than original. Every one I've seen has a flower vase. Side windows roll down, the rear glass drops down. Combined, they help with ventilation for hot weather. In cold weather, well, you wore a heavy coat. I mean, people were just tougher back then. Visibility out the front is very good, lots of glass. It is awkward by modern standards driving from the rear seat, but driving back then was just different.
So this is first, second, third, fourth, fifth.
I felt a little kick,
So-
fourth and fifth.
That's when you feel the kick, because they're in. I always get this wrong. They're in parallel for the first 3, and then when you go to 4 and 5, they go into series.
Right. The speed controller gets you going. You work up through the speeds 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There is a reverse speed as well. When the car was first introduced in 1907, a steering tiller was not uncommon, but in later years of production, it was unusual. There are some Detroit Electrics with dual controls. This allows a chauffeur to drive the vehicle from the front, or the owner can drive it by themselves from the rear seat, because you didn't want your butt in the same seat as the chauffeur. I guess that's not classy. Near the driver were light switches for exterior and interior lights. Let's talk about the gauges. They have a clock. This gauge is by Stuart Warner. Around this time, Stuart had just completed its acquisition of rival Warner, thus the name. It has an odometer, a tripometer that can be reset, and a speedometer. True to nature of early electric vehicles, speed was not a prominent part of the gauges. On the left is an amp meter showing the flow of electricity into the battery when charging and out of the battery when driving the motor. Most modern EVs indicate the same thing somewhere in the display of information. It tells you how hard you're driving or charging the vehicle. On the right is a voltmeter, and you kind of use that as a fuel gauge. If you're at 84 volts, you're full or somewhere around full. When it drops, you're headed towards empty.
So the 16 was built in 16.
Here you can see it pulling up to 100 amps times 84 volts. That works out to a little bit more than 10 horsepower.
Retitled as a 28, but Jack.
There are leaf springs at each corner to soak up the bumps on modern roads. On old roads, you'll probably need to slow down a little.
The parking brake, which is a good thing.
Oh, that stopped pretty good though.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. I mean, it took a ways, you know.
Yeah.
If there had been somebody stopping right in front of me, I would have been. It only stops with the mechanical brake is how hard you push that pedal.
Like its competitors, the brakes were only at the rear using mechanical drum brakes. Lesser vehicles of the time used band brakes that clamp around the outside and do even less good a job of stopping the vehicle. This Detroit Electric has metal spoked wheels. You'll see others with artillery-style wooden spoked wheels. Anderson produced 1,000 cars a year or more, ramping up to a peak in 1916 of nearly 1,900 cars.
Detroit, basically. So I think I'm actually going to turn around right here.
Yeah.
Which is going to work out nicely because there's nobody coming the other way too, as long as I do the brakes properly. The other thing that you find is you go slow around corners because the car is top heavy.
Yeah, the batteries are up.
Batteries are
Pretty
up real
high,
and that's
yeah.
another reason I think, I don't know for sure, but why they went with an aluminum body. Yeah, so you just take everything a little bit slower.
Yeah.
You know, with these kinds of cars and enjoy the ride. That's the main thing, is enjoying the ride.
Yeah. Separately, in 1912, Cadillac introduced the first car with a self-starting motor, eliminating the need to crank start the vehicle. Other gas engine manufacturers also quickly added this feature too, and more gasoline filling stations went into business. Electric cars did have some renewed popularity during World War I due to rationing and higher fuel prices, but by the roaring 20s, their higher cost and lower power could not keep up with the advancements of combustion engine vehicles. Detroit Electric became even more of a custom manufacturer. You'll sometimes come across vehicles today that have two manufacturing dates.
When they would take a trade-in back in the 20s of an earlier car, they would actually modify them a fair amount. They would modernize them, and they lowered the roof lines typically by 3 to 4 inches. And they'd do some other things, like they'd put carriage lights on it. But they could actually then re-badge them as a newer car.
In 1920, their prized motor and controller business was spun off to raise money.
In fact, this car is somewhat unique because they used to buy all their motors from the same company. And they had a falling out with that company in 1925. And they bought 48 motors from another company. And then after that, the first motor company woke up and said, "Oops, you know, we'll be nice again."
Yeah.
And they made amends, and they.
In 1929, Detroit Electric filed for bankruptcy and was sold. The Detroit Electric factory was located at the intersection of Clay and Ryopel in Detroit. It's gone if you're looking for it. Now, across the street is the Russell Industrial Center. Also, cool art stuff goes on there. Following bankruptcy, they spun off their body making operations to Murray Body, which operated in the Russell building. So there is some connection to that existing building. Last building I'll mention, I stumbled across this one. In Kansas City, there's a sales and service building for the Detroit Electric. An application has been submitted to get it on the National Register of Historic Places. I'll put lots of links in the notes if you want to follow up on any of these. It's definitely like going down a rabbit hole of history. In these final years, Detroit Electric continued refurbishing old models and started making new EVs using bodies from other companies. This 1937 car is a Detroit Electric with the front body from a Dodge. You can see through the windshield, there's the tiller steering bar, which was still being used in these Detroit Electrics. EVs that were still in operation during World War II saw increased popularity, again for the same reason: rationing and high fuel prices. In total, from 1907 to 1939, Detroit is said to have sold 13,290 electric vehicles. That includes some commercial trucks and a handful of those strange body swaps that came later on. There are 138 registered private owners of Detroit Electrics in the Antique Electric Car Club, with more in museums in North America and around the world. They sold all over the place. One last thing as I mix in random footage of those wonderful pieces of history. In 2008, the Detroit Electric was reborn as a two-seat, all electric sports car based on a Lotus that would compete against, yeah, you know. They still have a website. There are pictures of them rolling off the assembly line, but the company didn't make it. But you did. You made it to the end of this video. Lots of parallels between EVs then and now. The big difference is we've got better technology now and social media. Thanks for watching.